Good morning, everyone. Sorry I'm a few minutes late. That's, I guess, what happens when you go live and it's not pre-recorded. But I wanted to get everything in order and make sure I had everything ready so we could do this presentation. And I'm really excited with how it turned out. And I can't wait to share all these resources with you and all these amazing women that I'm going to highlight. And I have some books that I'm going to share and just this has been stories I've learned from freelance writing for various publications, also for my blog and my podcast. So, this has been a accumulation of over 6 years of research, and I pulled some of the stories together, and I'm really excited to share them. So, let's get started. And actually, oops, I've never done this, so I'm trying to figure it out. So, first, we're going to talk about women from Revolutionary War, and the woman that I want to highlight is Deborah Sampson, and she dressed up as a male to serve, and she even removed her own bullet from her wound when she was injured in battle to keep her gender hidden, and she served for about 2-ish years. They don't know the exact dates of like when she joined, and they know when she left and when she was discovered, but she fell ill during an epidemic, and the doctor who was treating her discovered that she was a woman, and he was kind enough to not reveal her gender while she was recuperating because they could have easily just kicked her out and said, "You're not allowed to be here, you're a woman." But he allowed her to get better, and then he sent a letter with her to the general in charge, and she was quickly discharged from the military. And she just has a remarkable story. And I think what's cool about Deborah Sampson and really all the women is I'm highlighting one woman from a specific group, but there's so many other women who have amazing stories and have so much, rich history. So Deborah Sampson is one woman that we know about, but there were many other women that we don't know about and many other things going on. So, and feel free to put a comment. I see Bob's comment. He's super excited to watch this episode. So, thanks so much for all your support. And then I'll try and answer questions if I see them while we're watching. So, let's move on to the next slide. And so, we're going to move on to the Civil War. And the first woman that I want to highlight from the Civil War era is Dr. Mary Edwards Walker. She is the first and only woman to be awarded the Medal of Honor, and she was a doctor and she wanted to serve in the military, but they told her she couldn't because she was a woman, and she didn't think that was a good answer. So instead of serving in and being an officer, she decided she'd volunteer, but they still limited her to nurse duties. So she took things into her own hands, left the DC area, went to Virginia, and started working near the front lines. She was able to do surgery and trauma work when she was there because they needed all hands on deck. And she was even captured. She sometimes served as a spy and also as a doctor. And she was captured with a group of other doctors and served as a prisoner of war for a few months. And then in 19, my face is in the way. So she received the Medal of Honor in 1865, and then there was a look at what people should have Medal of Honors, and in 1960 it was 16. It was taken away from her, but she wore it until her death, until 1919. She was like, "I'm not giving it back. I did what I did. I'm proud of my service." And her family advocated, and she was able to get her Medal of Honor reinstated by President Jimmy Carter in 1977. So even though it went away, it did come back. And so that's part of her legacy. And then I also wanted to highlight Harriet Tubman. She is well known for her work on the Underground Railroad, helping slaves escape from slavery under a series of network to get people from the South to the North. And so many of us learned about her when we were in childhood, but she also worked during the Civil War. She was a spy and she provided integral information. And one thing you may not know about her is that she was illiterate and she had an amazing memory. So even though she couldn't write anything down, she was able to remember facts and details. And she was crucial in helping to coordinate the Combahee ferry raid, and she actually was at the raid while it was happening, and she led the boats down the river, helped them know where torpedoes were hidden and other traps, and she ended up in the chaos of everything, leading 150 men during the operation, and over 700 slaves were free, and it was a huge success, and it was all in part to her memory and her leadership, and that the Union Army trusted her to help run the operation. But she has such a remarkable story. I feel like it's almost a disservice that we only know about her work as the Underground Railroad because that's just a tiny piece of her history. So she's an amazing woman, has such an amazing story, and I highly recommend you learn more about her. Now we're gonna go to World War One, and I have to tell a little funny story because I was working on the slides this morning as my kids were getting ready just to go to school, and my son was looking over my shoulder, and it went from Civil War to World War II, and he was like, "What about World War One?" And so I remembered that I should add women from World War One, and of course, women served as nurses, but one of the most I don't know if they're well known, but one of the most interesting groups that um, had a huge impact during the war was the Hello Girls. They were telephone operators in Europe during World War One, and the chief operator was Grace Banker, and she was key. The women who were there got there in 1918 and were able to help, allow communication to improve. It happened that while shortly after they arrived, the communication started improving. And this was due to technology, but also having women there to operate and run the phone lines. And so they were crucial as the war, wrapped up and ended to get the information around and such an important part of history, and they were awarded the distinguished, or Grace Banker was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal, and they there's been some documentaries and some other information shared about the Hello Girls, and so this is just a tiny piece of their story, but they're such amazing women from history who stepped up, filled not traditional roles, went overseas during the war, and so many people don't know about their service and the sacrifice that they made to support the war effort during World War One. So that's that. And then now we're going to go into World War II, which I've spent a lot of time learning about the women of World War II. And one of the things that I think is important to talk about why World War II was so important was because it gave women so many opportunities. And then at the end of World War II, the inner women's okay, now I'm blanking because I didn't write it down. But in 1948, the Women's Service Integration Act, there we go, was passed and it allowed women to serve in the military outside of time at war. Before that, women could only serve in limited capacities, often in the nursing field or very specific career fields. And while it didn't change all the things. It took until 2015 before women could serve in all roles. It did open the door to allow women to continue serving in the military after World War II was over, and that really had an impact. And so it's amazing to hear the stories of how women served. And so I'm going to highlight some different groups and then highlight some of the women who led those groups just to share their stories. And I have a few books to my right that I'll be able to pull up and share with you as well. So the first person is Lieutenant Colonel Nancy Harkness Love. And I should have put my books in order. I listened to this book on audiobook. It's called The Women with Silver Wings by Catherine Sharp Landeck. And she was on my podcast in episode, I wrote it down, 223. And so I think we did it last year during Women's History Month. And what I loved about Catherine's book is how she told the story and weaved the story together by highlighting certain people's stories. And one of the people that she highlighted a lot, besides Jackie Cochran, who is also very pivotal to the creation of the WASP, was Nancy Love. And I learned about the WASP from this book, which is Final Flight, Final Fight. And it's about Erin Miller. Her episode is 49. And she was on the podcast and shared about her grandmother who served as a WASP. And when she died, she wanted to be interned at Arlington. And they said no. And so her family, and she was kind of the lead advocate, uh, worked to get the law passed, changed, and passed so that she could be interned at Arlington National Cemetery. And so, what I love about Erin's book is not only does it talk about the history of the WASP, but it also talks about like the congressional system of how you get a law into place. And so I learned a lot, and I was like, when my sons are in 8th grade, I'm gonna have them read this book, just so they can learn about how a law goes through Congress, how people advocate for it, how you get different congressmen and women on board, and then the whole process. And so I think it's really cool the way that she put the book together because she highlights both the history of like her grandmother's service and then along with, this great lesson in how the government works. And then uh Catherine's book uh is the history of the women, and it goes back farther because Elaine served near the end of the WASP program. And so when Catherine shares the stories of what happened, it goes way back and even goes to when the women's auxiliary, even before the women's auxiliary ferrying squadron, which was led by Nancy, started, and then the work that Jackie Cochran was doing, the women flying training detachment, and then how those two came together, and then the like politics of what was going on behind the scenes as they tried to get these women to be recognized for their service and all the different things. It's such an interesting book and such an amazing story. And if you don't know about the WASP, over 1,000 women graduated from the training, and they also 38 women died. And because they weren't in the military, they had to pay, their own way to get the bodies home, and the families were not compensated for their service. And the WASP, the reason the program was created was so that more male pilots could go overseas to fight. And so they were in charge of ferrying aircraft from the factories to the bases. They helped train male pilots on how to fly. And they also, had targets at the back of their planes that people shot at for target practice and a number of different other aviation specialties. But they just have such an amazing story, and they did so much for the war effort, and their story was almost lost because uh, the they weren't granted the veteran status that they were promised when they signed up. And people in the 1970s, when women started to serve as pilots, said, "Oh, the first women pilots." And that's when the WASP came out of their not talking about what they had done and advocated on Capitol Hill to get veteran status. And then when Elaine died, had to advocate again to ensure that they could be buried at Arlington. So lots of history, an amazing story. So I really hope that if you want to learn more, you check out either of those books. They're both great. I love them. 5 stars for both of them. And then the next group I want to highlight was led by Colonel Charity Adams early, and she led the six. It says 6888, but it's people say the 6888. Um, and they're the Central Post Directory Battalion, and they people were advocating to get more women overseas, and one of those advocacy groups wanted to get Black women overseas, and so her team was sent to sort mail. There was a backlog of 17 million pieces of mail, and they worked in 3 shifts, 24/7, And one of the stories that I've discovered over the years is that some general came to see, I think it's from this picture, but they came to see like the women and they wanted to do this big hoopla. And she pulled a few people who weren't working, who were on their off shift, to come and be at the battalion. And the women who were sleeping, they were sleeping, and then the women were working. And the general was like, "Where's everybody?" And she's like, "We're working. We've got to get the smell sorted." And so she had such great leadership. She was the highest ranking Black woman in the Army during the time of World War II. She was a major then and then promoted to lieutenant colonel after the war. And they were given 6 months to get the backlog of mail sorted, and they did it in three. And one of the other pieces of information I found was they found mail that had been there for 3 years before they had the mail was, you know, lost for 3 years, and they were finally able to get it delivered. And their motto was no mail, low morale. So they took their job very seriously, and they were able to do something I think a lot of people didn't think that they'd be able to do it, but they did. And it's amazing to hear their story. And they were in 2021, they were recently recognized and given I have it in my notes. The Congressional Gold Medal in 2021. So they were recognized for their service in 2021. So just amazing women. And another really cool thing that is currently in the works is Tyler Perry is doing a movie about their story called 688. And I got to do a story coverage on it for We Are the Mighty. And so I have a bunch of links that I'll share once I'm done. And that's one of the articles that I got to share and highlight the amazing story of these women. So I'll make sure to put that in the comments when I'm done. So the next person I want to highlight is Elizabeth Pete McIntosh. And the reason that I wanted to highlight her story is because I learned about her story because she wrote an article that went unpublished for 71 years. She was at the attack at Pearl Harbor and she was working as a journalist, and she went down to, as close as she could get to see what was going on. And then she wrote a graphic detail of everything that happened. And because it was so graphic, they refused to publish it. And so it wasn't until 71 years later that it was finally published. And then a few years later, I was reading this book. It's called The Girls Who Stepped Out of Line. It's by Major General Mary Eater. She's retired Major General, and she was on the podcast, episode 70. And so she wrote this book about women from World War II. And I'm reading Elizabeth's story, and she was in the Operations Service Support, which is OSS, which is what eventually led to the CIA. So she was part of the spy um, operations, and her story is in here. And I'm reading the story and I was like, this lady's name sounds familiar and I feel like I know who she is. And so I looked up. The article I wrote about Elizabeth is also on We Are the Mighty, and so I'll share that as well. And so I looked it up and I was like, wow, her story is even more amazing than I thought, because it doesn't just end with her being a journalist in Hawaii during Pearl Harbor, but it continues into the war. And she was fluent in Japanese, so she was sent overseas to India and China, and she worked in morale operations. And one of the things they did was they created scripts for a popular Chinese fortune teller that people in Japan and China listened to. And the day that the atomic bomb was dropped, not because she knew, they had written this thing that something bad was going to happen in Japan because there was just evil, and she had written this whole script with her team. And then later that day, the atomic bomb dropped. And so it was a coincidence, but also kind of freaked the people out because of how it happened. And so that was one of the most interesting stories that popped out. And then also, I don't know if there's a Julia Child show on HBO Max that I've had a chance to listen to or to watch. And Elizabeth worked with Julia Child during and in the OSS overseas, and they got to meet and become friends. And so in the show Julia Child on HBO Max, she talks about her days at the OSS, and so it's really cool to see how those pieces of history are coming into like modern day culture. And so I just thought that was a really cool story, and um, I really, I really recommend this book. I love it. There's gonna be Charity Adams. Her story is in here too from the 688, and there's also a story from Wasp, a different Wasp, and a different wasp than the ones that I mentioned, but more stories and stories of nurses and stories of women who helped Jews escape during the Holocaust. It's just amazing to hear all these different stories, uh, and Mary is such a great lady, and I really enjoyed getting to meet her through the podcast, and we've got to talk and stay friends after. And so I really love her book and highly recommend it. You're gonna have lots of books to read at the end of this. So, okay, this is another book that I read. I had Audible during the pandemic, and so I don't actually have a physical copy of this book, but I have it in my reading library from Audible. And there was a 2-for-1 sale, and so I picked a book that was about history and then a book about that was fiction because I really like fiction. But I accidentally, or I don't know, I just said, "Oh, women who smash codes," or that sounds like an interesting book, and so I added it to my library. It is the most amazing, fascinating story that you've never heard of. Elizabeth often gets overshadowed by her husband. Um, I don't know his name, but he was a code breaker as well, and he worked on the Enigma, and he did a lot of work for the army during the war. And because and so she was often referred to as the wife of him. And so, but she did a bunch of amazing work, even though she was a mom and a wife, and and it was kind of not traditional, but she had started her career as a analyst before the war, and she had already done an amazing work for the army or for the navy. And so she started working in South America doing all this work to decode um, thousands and thousands of messages. And her story is just so amazing. And I was actually really disappointed because I read the book in the pandemic. And so I don't have like all the details. And as I was doing research, I could find very little information to highlight her story. And so I really recommend checking out Jason's book. It's so good. It goes through her story and highlights her husband's story and like interweaves them together. And she did amazing things to prevent the Nazis from getting a base hold in South America, which could have changed the tide of the war. Just it was so remarkable to hear her story and to see the work that she did. And for so long, she wasn't even recognized for the work that she did. So she's an amazing lady, and her story is amazing. So I'm really glad that I, by chance, got that book and got to read her story. And so I would really recommend you check that book out as well. It's so good. So next we're gonna go to Vietnam, and if you've been watching me on LinkedIn, I shared a couple weeks ago that I finished The Woman by Kristen Hanna, and she wrote a story about the nurses in Vietnam. And my mom recommended I read that book, and my friend that was reading it said, "You have to read this book." And so I did easily. Kristen Hanna is one of my favorite authors, and so I was really excited to read her story. And one of the things that I don't think people realize about the nurses who served during Vietnam is that they were such a tiny group, and so many people had like shame for women for serving in Vietnam. And so when Sharon Lane died and was killed by a rocket that landed between Ward A and Ward B, that was like a really big deal. And it was one of the things that Kristen Hanna her book is a novel. It's not real, but she used real places and real events, and she talked about Sharon Lane in that book. And so I I just wanted to highlight her story. I'm gonna do an episode later in the month on the nurses from the military because I think the nurse corps really opened the door for women to serve in the military, and it actually even the I learned I'm giving away more from but in the Civil War, that wasn't a field that women were in. And then because of the Civil War, they needed women to fill roles, and the nurse corps opened for them. And then it went from being a primarily male dominated career field to a primarily woman dominated, career field. And that happened because of the Civil War and because of the military. And so I think that history and those stories are so important to be shared because in the book, the woman follows uh, primarily three women, and then of course the protagonist. And uh, the main character goes through severe PTSD, and she went to the VA twice in the book to try and get help, and was told, "Well, you weren't number one, women don't serve, didn't serve in Vietnam," which wasn't true. And she was also told, well, I was a nurse. And then they were like, well, you weren't in combat, were you? But they served in dangerous locations, they were rocketed, and they also experienced trauma. And so I think it's really important to highlight how amazing these women were. They volunteered to serve in the military at a time when it was not popular. So I just really wanted to highlight them as a whole, and then just remember Sharon Lane because she gave her life for our country by serving to help uh, men who were overseas. So that is it. Oh, I realized right before I did this that I missed someone that I wanted to talk about. And I guess I thought I added a slide, but I guess I didn't. So, in the 1970s, I mentioned earlier that um in the 1970s, that's when women were allowed to serve as pilots. And so you might think the first women pilots served in the Air Force, which I mean, technically it was the Army Air Corps with the WASP, but the first women pilots that the military allowed to be officers in the military actually served in the Navy. And I got to interview Beverly Weintraub and talk about her book Wings of Gold, which highlights the stories of the six women pilots who served in the Navy, and it goes through their story and also goes into the politics behind women. And so I like politics when it's not controversial, I guess. I like politics when it explains like why history happened. And so I really enjoyed her book because I got to learn so much about the history of women pilots. And if I had finished my slides, I would have included Captain Rosemary Mariner. She was one of the six women. She's an amazing story. They were all amazing. They all had their own unique challenges and their own differences. But reading Beverly's book, Wings of Gold, that story really stood out to me. And so I just wanted to highlight her. And I'm going to do this is the first week. I'm going to do episodes each week to celebrate Women's History Month. And so this is the first week. We talked about women who served in the military, women from history. And then next week, we're going to highlight women nurses. And then the week after that, now I'm blanking. I thought I wrote it down, but apparently I didn't. Um, and then so I don't know what we're gonna do the third week, but it'll be great. So come back for that. And then the final week, we're gonna talk about how women. Oh, I remember. The third week is gonna be women from 1970 to 1990. It was one of the uh, requested topics in the comment section when I said on LinkedIn that I was gonna do this. And so uh, there's a lot of history, especially like including this book. That happened between 1970 and 1990, the end-ish of Vietnam War and Korea, and then the beginning of the Gulf War. So there's like no wars, but there are a lot of conflicts, and then a lot of amazing things happen for women. And so I really want to highlight like what happened and how all that advocacy has changed and made things possible and opened the door, to women being able to serve as pilots in combat, and then in uh, and then in 2015, women allowing to serve in all jobs within the military. And that's what the last week will be about, talking about the role women played during Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Iraqi Freedom, and the different teams and groups of women that made it so that women could serve in combat roles. And so I'm excited to highlight these stories. If you don't know, I love talking about women in the military. I'm so grateful for all of you that are watching. If you enjoyed this video, please share it. And thank you so much for being a part of this. And I can't wait to see you guys all next week. And thank you, everyone.